On Capitol Hill, 2013 will go down in history as the least productive and arguably the least popular Congress ever. By the numbers, the two legislative bodies in the 113th Congress have sent President Obama for his signature just 64 bills. In President George W. Bush's term, the lowest figure in any one year was 136, double the amount passed this year. And to put it all in perspective, the 80th Congress, which President Harry Truman dubbed the Do-Nothing Congress, passed 395 bills in 1 year. For more, we're joined by Al Jazeera English contributor Jason Johnson. He's a professor of political science at Hiram College. He joins us from our studio in Washington, D.C. Jason, thanks for joining us. How do you explain so few bills getting through this year?
Because you have large numbers of members of Congress who think that their job is to stop this administration from passing bills rather than coming up with policy to pass. And that's the root of it. And the sad part is that for many congressional observers, we operated under the assumption that the 2012 election would sort of break this fever, that members of the Republican Party and some of the blue dog Democrats would finally say, okay, President Obama got reelected on this policy, I guess we should start to pass laws. But no, in many ways, many members of Congress have become more entrenched since the re-election. That's where we're here.
Well, but I mean, there have always been ideologues in Congress. I mean, I want to, for example, show you a Senator Richard Shelby from Alabama, perhaps as ideological as it gets. He says, it is not how many bills you pass, it's how many you stop. A lot of them are bad. What's wrong with the ideological view that, hey, the role of Congress is to keep the administration from creating new laws because that somehow gets in the way of the American people?
Well, because we've got multiple wars going on, we have ridiculously high levels of unemployment, we have student loan rates that are out of control, and we have a completely dysfunctional health care bill. There's absolutely no excuse for Congress to be this ineffective, given the problems that the country faces are so obvious. And I've said this for a long time. Congressional approval rates are at 9%. I think the American Revolution, they had a higher approval rate than, I mean, that's as bad as you can get for an entire body of the U.S. government. But again, most of the Republicans seem to think that stopping Obama is the only way to operate. And unfortunately, they're not really addressing most of the problems that the country is really concerned about.
But there have been previous presidents that were unpopular where members of Congress felt the goal was to stop them. Is there something particular about President Obama that you think is at play here?
He's black, he's a Democrat, and he is seen as being the most liberal president that we've ever had. And those are just the honest-to-goodness reasons behind it. Look, I understand and actually agree with some of the things that the Republicans are arguing about. There's plenty of problems with the Affordable Care Act, and there's things that Democrats have been concerned with. But when you really think about it, for only 60 bills to be passed, 64 bills to be passed in this entire year, with all the other problems that the United States is facing, this is one of the reasons why the 2014 elections are going to be so critical. Is the United States citizen finally going to break this hold?
Well, you mentioned the president's race, the fact that he's black. How is that a factor? I mean, how do you prove that it's because of his skin color that's why they're doing this?
Well, all you have to do is look at the large numbers of Republican voters and large numbers of members of Congress who represent the idea that he is an illegitimate president. And I know this is not a popular thing to say, but it's not like the people who doubted whether or not Obama was a citizen, doubted whether or not he was legitimately being elected to president of the United States. It's not like those people disappeared after 2008 and 2012.
Right, but it's also not like they're a majority of the Republican Party. Most members of Congress said that those minority members who went there were nuts and that they were doing a disfavor. So again, that doesn't really explain why a majority of the Republicans would suggest, hey, we can't allow things to become law.
No, it actually works the same way, because if you look, it only takes 20 or 30 members. Look, the vast majority of the Republican Party didn't necessarily want a government shutdown, but you had 20 or 30 members who were representing districts that said, look, we would rather have the government shut down than allow this president to go forward with the Affordable Care Act, which they thought was bad policy that would destroy the country. And I'm not saying that every single person who's against the Affordable Care Act is a racist. That's not what it's about. There are plenty of reasons to dislike Obama anyway, but the level of resistance to this president seems unprecedented for what he's actually done, which isn't that much.
Right, but historians also say that the level of disengagement that this particular president has had in terms of building relationships with members of Congress has also been at somewhat historic highs. Doesn't the president bear some of the responsibility for not developing better relationships, for not at least trying to go the more bipartisan route or coming up with legislation that Republicans can join in on, even if there are some Republicans who aren't going to support anything he does?
I don't think that's possible. And here's the reason why. If you look at the debt negotiations with John Boehner, Barack Obama was left naked at the poker table every time. He's a horrible negotiator. The Republicans really got a lot of what they wanted through the first several years. Even the Affordable Care Act isn't nearly what the Democrats initially claimed that they wanted and what they ran on in 2008. I don't think that President Obama, for all of his flaws, he cannot make friends with people who do not want to work with him. And unfortunately, under most circumstances, whether it was George Bush in 2004 or Bill Clinton in 1996, usually after a president is reelected, the opposition party says, okay, we're going to work with him a bit more. But we actually had a government shutdown after Obama was reelected for the same policies. So no, I don't think there's much else he can do other than try to stand his ground and accomplish something before 2014 and is a complete lame duck.
Well, I want to show you some approval numbers here, because I think this does get at one of the reasons why people will not work with President Obama. First, according to the latest Washington Post ABC News new poll regarding Congress, 16% approve of the job Congress is doing, a whopping 81% disapprove. Perhaps no surprise there. But take a look at the approval numbers right now for President Obama. 41% of Americans approve the job he's doing. 56% of Americans disapprove of the job he's doing. This has been the case for a couple of months now. Why should members of Congress go along with a president who is that unpopular?
Oh, they probably shouldn't, but they wouldn't go along with him even when he was popular. And I think that's what's important here. Just because the Affordable Care Act, and that's really what a lot of this year has been wrapped up in, just because that's unpopular policy doesn't mean that we shouldn't have been doing things about unemployment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have been doing other things about health care. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing other things about jobs bills. That's the issue. The fact that the members of Congress have not been able to come up with policies that sometimes even circumvent the President of the United States. Just because Obama may be off in the wilderness somewhere on policies that people don't like does not excuse Congress for not getting anything done. It's not like we've seen an unprecedented level of vetoes from the President of the United States. So this really does fall on Congress's back. Obama, as feckless as he can be sometimes, he's at least tried to get some things done.
Well, here's what President Obama said at his news conference on Friday about what 2014 might look like. Watch.
I firmly believe that 2014 can be a breakthrough year for America.
Congress has agreed that to come up with a budget for 2 years so there won't be a government shutdown. Congress won't get in the way in that sense. Are you optimistic that things will get better in 2014?
Yeah, I'm optimistic because it's an election year. And every time there's an election year, it's sort of like, Jesus is coming, look busy, right? Every member of Congress feels like they've got to get some laws passed in order to go back to their constituents and say that they've actually done something. So I do think we will see a much more productive Congress next year. Whether or not those policies will address the deep underlying problems of income inequality, continual unemployment, our horrible health care system, and all the other issues of legislation that chokes small business in this country, I don't know if all those problems will get fixed, but I do think Congress will be more active in 2014.
I'm going to disagree with you at the end. It's my experience that election years less gets done, and you don't want to go to your voters, particularly in districts that are now going to extremes. There are very few swing districts. I think a lot of members of Congress simply, particularly the Republican side, they don't want to support anything the president has done, particularly in an election year. But we'll see. Al Jazeera English contributor Jason Johnson. Jason, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Anytime.
One of the